Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most infamous figures of ancient Rome, an emperor whose very name became a byword for madness, cruelty, and excess, Caligula. For centuries, whispers of his reign have carried tales of extravagance, brutality, and the strange depths of human behavior when one man held absolute power. His story is one that unsettles as much as it fascinates, and tonight we'll drift through that shadowed world, letting the pieces of his life unfold softly, layer by layer, until the image of a ruler both feared and pitied emerges from the haze of history. If this helps you relax, feel free to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Or simply close your eyes, let your thoughts quiet, and allow the past to carry you into rest. To understand Caligula, we begin not with his madness, but with the world that raised him. Born as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in the year 12 CE, he entered a family that was both admired and dangerous. His father, Germanicus, was one of Rome's most beloved generals, a man of charisma and honor. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a proud and strong-willed descendant of Augustus himself. In the eyes of the Roman people, Caligula was born to greatness. And yet, as history so often shows us, greatness and tragedy often walk side by side. As a child, he followed his father on military campaigns along the Rhine. Soldiers adored the boy, dressing him in miniature legionary armor. They called him Caligula, meaning little boots, a nickname born of affection, a soldier's joke that clung to him for life. Imagine him there, a small boy in a soldier's camp, laughter echoing through tents, boots far too big for his growing feet. He could never have imagined how history would remember that name, not as a symbol of innocence, but as a symbol of infamy. When his father died under suspicious circumstances, whispers of poison spread. His mother openly accused Emperor Tiberius, the ruler at the time, of orchestrating it. In Rome, such accusations were dangerous. Caligula's family was slowly torn apart. His mother was exiled, his brothers imprisoned or executed. The boy who had once been cherished by soldiers now lived beneath the shadow of suspicion and blood. Perhaps it was here that the seeds of darkness began to take root, nourished by fear and betrayal. As he grew, Caligula was taken into the household of Tiberius. The emperor was by then an old man, withdrawn and bitter, surrounded by cruelty and corruption. In that cold palace on the island of Capri, Caligula learned the ways of survival. He smiled when he needed to, obeyed when he must, and endured what could not be resisted. To live in Tiberius's court was to live in constant fear. Executions were common, loyalty meant little, and whispers could kill. Imagine being a young man in such an environment, where trust was a weakness, and cruelty was a daily spectacle. And yet, Caligula survived. He watched, he listened, and he endured. When Tiberius finally died in the year 37 CE, Caligula was named his successor. The people of Rome rejoiced. After years of a dour and cruel emperor, they looked to this young man with hope. He was the son of Germanicus, beloved by the army, the descendant of Augustus. His arrival was greeted with celebration, cheers filling the forum, prayers offered in temples, coins struck with his image. Rome believed it was entering a new golden age. For a brief moment it seemed they were right. Caligula began his reign with generosity. He released prisoners held unjustly, paid honors to his family's memory, staged magnificent games for the people. His popularity soared. Rome embraced him with open arms, and he basked in their adoration. But behind the bright surface, shadows lingered. Power, unchecked and absolute, has a way of unmasking the fragile edges of the human mind. And soon, cracks began to show. A sudden illness struck him down in the first year of his reign. For weeks he lay close to death, and when he finally rose again, many said he was changed. The generosity, the light, the hope, all seemed to dim. In their place emerged something darker, more erratic, more dangerous. Rome had asked for a savior, But what it received instead was a ruler whose name would echo through centuries as a symbol of excess, cruelty, and madness. And this is where our story truly begins. With a young man once cherished, now standing on the edge of power and insanity, ready to reshape Rome with fear and spectacle. When Caligula returned from the brink of death, Rome expected gratitude. They hoped the young emperor would continue his generous path, cherishing the second chance the gods had granted him. But instead, something inside him seemed fractured, as though illness had stripped away the mask he once wore. Those closest to him whispered that the man who had risen from that sickbed was not the same as the one who had first donned the purple. At first the changes were subtle. His laughter came at odd times, sharp and unsettling. His words grew unpredictable, shifting from kindness to cruelty in a breath. He began to see insults where none were given, threats in the mildest gestures. The court adjusted uneasily, bowing lower, smiling more carefully, wondering which Caligula they might face at any given hour. To displease him, even accidentally, was to risk ruin. The generosity of his first months faded into extravagance. He ordered banquets of staggering cost, with tables groaning under the weight of delicacies carried in from every corner of the empire. Whole fortunes vanished in a single feast, as he demanded rare wines, oysters in silver bowls, and exotic fruits piled high. Though many of his people starved outside palace gates, senators were expected to attend, their faces forced into expressions of admiration, even as their purses emptied to fund the emperor's whims. At times Caligula seemed to delight not only in spending wealth but in displaying its destruction. He scattered coins to crowds just to watch them fight, tore down costly structures only to rebuild them differently, and declared that money itself was meaningless when it did not serve to glorify him. To witness this was to see power twisted into play, where extravagance was not generosity but theatre. Then came gestures darker still. Those who displeased him, whether through disagreement or mere chance, found themselves ruined or worse. Trials were swift, punishments brutal. Executions became public entertainment, staged almost as though they were part of a grand spectacle. The line between justice and cruelty blurred until it vanished, leaving only the emperor's will. To live under Caligula was to live in constant fear, for loyalty was no shield, and favor could turn to suspicion in a heartbeat. There were stories whispered quietly, that his illness had not only broken his mind, but filled it with delusions of divinity. He began to speak of himself not as a man but as something greater, a living god. He dressed in the garb of Jupiter, Apollo, even Venus, parading in silken robes, demanding temples be dedicated to his name, insisting statues of himself be placed in shrines alongside the gods of old. For Romans this was more than arrogance, it was blasphemy. Yet to oppose him was unthinkable, for his wrath was swift, and no one wished to be the example he made of defiance. The Senate, once the heart of Rome's governance, was reduced to a chamber of trembling men, forced to shower him with honors, to address him not as a ruler, but as a divine presence. Their voices were hollow, their praises empty, but Caligula seemed blind to the fear beneath their words. Or perhaps he enjoyed it. Perhaps fear was the true tribute he sought, more intoxicating to him than gold, more powerful than worship itself. His relationship with the people grew equally complex. At times he lavished gifts upon the masses, distributing food and games with a generosity that seemed almost genuine. But just as often he mocked them, standing above the crowds in his palace, tossing down coins only to laugh as men and women scrambled and clawed at one another. To him the people were a stage, their desperation a form of amusement, and still the city whispered. Tales of his eccentricities spread quickly, of his endless banquets, of his cruel games, of his divine pretension. Some stories may have been exaggerated by enemies, others polished by rumor, but together they painted a picture of a man who had slipped beyond the bounds of reason. To live in Rome at that time was to live in a theater where the emperor was both actor and director, and every citizen a captive audience, unable to look away. Even within the palace, those closest to him lived in fear. Servants tread softly, never knowing whether a mistake would be punished with harsh words or sudden death. Advisors spoke carefully, crafting their words to soothe his moods, yet even silence could provoke suspicion. Imagine the unease of walking through marble halls lit by torches, the air heavy with smoke and whispers, knowing that behind every corner could be either favor or ruin. This was the world Caligula began to shape in the years after his illness, a world where extravagance masked cruelty, where fear replaced loyalty, where Rome itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of one man's instability. And as his reign deepened, the stories grew darker still, for his whims extended not only to wealth and power, but to life and death itself. For those who lived under him, each day was a gamble. To awaken was to wonder if one would see another dusk, or if some careless glance, some forgotten gesture, might draw the emperor's attention in the wrong way. It was not only the Senate, not only the wealthy, but every corner of society that felt the ripple of his reign. From the palace halls to the crowded streets, from the temples of the gods to the fields beyond the walls, Caligula's shadow reached everywhere. And so, as the young emperor strode more deeply into his delusions and excesses, Rome began to hold its breath. For they had seen emperors cruel before, emperors extravagant, emperors strange, but never had they seen one quite like this. Caligula was something else, unpredictable, unrestrained, and unafraid of consequence. His reign was no longer simply a rule of governance, but a performance of madness, and every Roman, whether noble or peasant, whether friend or foe, was compelled to watch as the performance grew ever more disturbing. As Caligula's reign unfolded, his love for spectacle began to shape the rhythm of Roman life. In a city already known for its games and performances, he elevated entertainment to something darker, stranger, more excessive than anything Rome had seen before. To Caligula, the stage was not confined to the arena. The city itself became his theatre, and every citizen an unwilling participant. He delighted in grand shows, sparing no expense to dazzle and bewilder the people. Colossal games were staged at the Circus Maximus, with chariots racing at blinding speeds, their wheels screeching as horses thundered across the sand. Exotic animals were brought from the farthest corners of the empire. Lions, leopards, even giraffes, paraded through the streets as symbols of Rome's reach and his own extravagance. Crowds roared with awe, their voices echoing through the vast arena, while Caligula watched from his imperial seat, basking in the admiration, or perhaps in the knowledge that he held all power over their joy. But with him, joy and cruelty were inseparable. The games he orchestrated were not merely for delight. They became tools of control, tests of loyalty, demonstrations of his dominion over life and death. Gladiators were ordered to fight to the death, not only for honor, but to satisfy his passing whims. At times he interrupted matches with sudden commands, forcing men to slaughter one another in unexpected ways, as though their lives were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard he toyed with. There are stories whispered across centuries that his cruelty reached beyond the arena floor. When the crowd demanded prisoners be spared, he occasionally granted mercy, but more often he did the opposite, executing those the people had sought to save, as though to remind them that mercy belonged only to him. Their pleas were powerless, their voices drowned beneath the emperor's laughter. In these moments, Rome was reminded that entertainment under Caligula was not meant to empower the masses, but to remind them of their helplessness. At times, his theatricality extended beyond Rome itself. He ordered entire fleets of ships to line up across the Bay of Baia, forming a temporary floating bridge stretching for miles across the water. Upon this man-made wonder, Caligula paraded in full armor, riding his horse across the waves as though conquering the sea itself. To many it was madness, to him it was theatre, a spectacle designed to demonstrate not only his wealth, but his command over the natural world. The empire watched in awe and confusion, unable to determine whether they were witnessing genius or lunacy. The games, the processions, the bizarre displays, they consumed the empire's wealth at an alarming rate. Treasuries drained, taxes rose, and yet the emperor continued. He seemed to care little for the strain upon Rome's economy. What mattered was the show, the illusion of magnificence, the endless proof of his grandeur. For the common people it was dazzling but fleeting. For the senators and the elite, it was a source of growing unease. They saw the empire's stability slipping into the grasp of one man's fantasy. Yet Caligula seemed oblivious or perhaps indifferent to their concerns. To him, Rome existed as his audience, and an emperor who fancied himself divine needed a stage worthy of his performance. The boundaries of reality and theatre blurred, until one could no longer tell whether his actions were political, personal, or purely for spectacle. In private, too, his theatrics continued. Banquets became performances of excess. Guests dined, not only on delicacies, but on dishes crafted to shock and overwhelm. Imagine walking into a hall lined with gilded couches, torchlight flickering on silver platters piled with foods most had never seen. Roasted peacocks, gilded loaves of bread, entire animals prepared in ways meant more to display wealth than to nourish. To dine with Caligula was to step into a surreal performance, where luxury itself became almost grotesque. And yet, beneath the golden veneer, fear lingered. At any moment, the feast could transform into a stage for humiliation or violence. A guest might be mocked for their attire, stripped of their dignity before the crowd. A senator might find himself accused of treason in the midst of laughter, dragged from the table to face death. No one was safe, for the emperor's sense of humor was unpredictable, and his cruelty as quick as it was theatrical. The people of Rome, watching from outside the palace walls, whispered stories of these feasts, their imaginations filling the gap. Each retelling grew more vivid, more horrifying, until fact and rumor intertwined into a single legend. Perhaps that was part of his power, the uncertainty. No one could say with certainty what was true, and that uncertainty itself bred fear. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss these tales as exaggeration, as the work of enemies who sought to tarnish his name, and perhaps some of them were. Yet even if half were true, the image that emerges is chilling. An emperor who viewed life itself as theatre, whose people existed as his audience, whose cruelty was masked as spectacle. Imagine living in that Rome, walking its streets as the emperor paraded through, his soldiers lining the way, his laughter carried on the wind. You might cheer with the crowd, your voice raised high, but in your heart you would feel the tremor of fear, knowing that tomorrow's spectacle might demand a victim, and that victim could be anyone. This was the Rome of Caligula, a city where spectacle and terror danced hand in hand, where no celebration was free of unease, where the emperor's whims determined the fates of thousands. And as his reign deepened, the performances only grew more bizarre, more extravagant, more terrifying, until it seemed there was no limit to the lengths he would go to maintain his theatre of power. As Caligula's reign stretched on, the line between reality and delusion thinned, until it seemed to vanish altogether. The young emperor, once hailed as Rome's savior, now appeared to see himself not as a man at all, but as something far greater. Whispers in the city grew louder. Caligula believed himself divine. At first it was subtle. He began to appear in public dressed as various gods, draped in golden robes, adorned with jewels that shimmered in torchlight. One day he might walk through the streets as Jupiter, holding the thunderbolt, the king of gods himself. Another day he would don the flowing garb of Apollo, strumming a lyre and basking in the adoration of crowds who dared not withhold their cheer. Sometimes disturbingly he even appeared as Venus, the goddess of love, his face painted, his body wrapped in silks. To Romans, whose traditions respected the gods deeply, this was shocking, sacrilegious. Yet who could speak against? Who would risk defying a man who claimed both the throne and the heavens? Temples across Rome were ordered to install statues of Caligula alongside those of the gods. Sacrifices, once reserved for Jupiter or Mars, were redirected to him. Coins were struck with his image crowned in divine symbols, reinforcing the illusion that he was no longer merely emperor, but God made flesh. The Senate, humiliated, bowed and worshipped him, their voices echoing through marble halls, as they addressed him not as ruler but as deity. Their praises were hollow, trembling, but Caligula seemed to thrive on them. The further he leaned into his divine fantasies, the more bizarre his demands became. He ordered a temple to be built in his honor, staffed not by ordinary priests, but by men and women chosen from Rome's elite. Senators found themselves reduced to servants, forced to tend his altars, to pour wine and burn incense as though he were Jupiter himself. Imagine the unease of Rome's most powerful men, kneeling before a young emperor, their dignity stripped away, their authority shattered, offering worship not to the gods they revered, but to the unstable man who controlled their fate. But it was not enough. Caligula's delusions demanded more. He looked beyond Rome, toward Judea, where a grand temple stood in Jerusalem, the sacred heart of a people fiercely devoted to their God. He ordered that his statue be placed in that temple, towering over the worshippers, forcing them to bow to him. To the Jewish people this was not only blasphemy, but desecration. Rebellion stirred, and only the careful intervention of governors and diplomats prevented open war. Even so, the order itself revealed the depths of his megalomania, for Caligula did not simply want Rome to worship him, he wanted the entire empire to bow, and in his private chambers the delusions grew stranger still. He spoke openly of conversing with the gods, of sharing their power, of standing above the world as its master. At times he laughed at the idea of mortality, declaring that he could not die because he was no longer human. At other times he seemed almost obsessed with proving his divinity through cruelty. If he held power over life and death, did that not make him a god already? To those who lived in his presence, it was terrifying. A senator who failed to show proper reverence might find himself stripped of property, exiled or executed. An innocent remark could be twisted into blasphemy, and all the while the emperor's laughter filled the halls of power, echoing against the marble, reminding everyone that his favor was as unstable as fire, warming in one moment, destroying in the next. Rome itself grew restless under the weight of his delusion. The people once adoring, now whispered nervously in markets and streets. To defy him was impossible, but to embrace him as divine felt equally unbearable. Fear became the air they breathed, each day unpredictable, each spectacle stranger than the last. The empire had seen cruel rulers before, had endured extravagance and madness, but this was something different. This was an emperor who no longer saw himself bound by human law, by custom, even by mortality itself. There are tales, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps true, of Caligula holding conversations with statues, mocking the gods as though they were rivals, not deities. He supposedly ordered the heads of famous statues removed and replaced with his own likeness, so that Rome's sacred figures now bore his fate. Imagine standing in a temple, looking up at a statue once meant to honor Apollo or Mars, only to see instead the features of the emperor staring back at you. For Romans it must have felt as though the very foundations of their world were shifting, sacred and profane melting into one. And through it all, Caligula's demands drained the empire's wealth, his cruelty drained its spirit, and his divine delusions drained its hope. Rome was trapped in a performance it could not escape, with an emperor who believed himself not just a ruler, but the center of existence itself. Those who dared to imagine the future wondered what path he would take next. Would his reign spiral into greater blasphemies, greater cruelties, until even the gods themselves seemed mocked? Or would some force, some unseen hand, finally halt the madness? In those days,
No one could say. They only knew that Rome had fallen into the grasp of a man who believed himself more than mortal, and that their lives now moved to the rhythm of his delusions.
As Caligula's belief in his own divinity grew, so too did the cruelty with which he wielded power. For him, authority was not a responsibility but a tool, a stage upon which he could display his dominance over others, and no one in Rome, not senator, not soldier, not servant, was safe from the shadow of his whims. The Senate, once the pillar of Roman governance, bore the brunt of his games. Caligula seemed to take delight in stripping away their dignity piece by piece, as though humiliating Rome's most powerful men were itself a form of entertainment. In the Senate chambers, he would arrive unannounced, his footsteps echoing on the marble, his eyes sweeping the room with a mixture of scorn and amusement. He mocked their speeches, interrupted their debates, and forced them into absurd displays of loyalty. On some occasions, senators were ordered to run beside his chariot like slaves, their robes soiled with dust as the emperor laughed from above. At other times, they were forced to kiss his feet, their trembling lips pressed to the sandals of the man they once considered their equal. These gestures were not simple acts of power. They were performances of domination, staged so that everyone would remember their humiliation. But even humiliation was not the worst fate. For those who fell out of favor, often for reasons as small as a poorly timed glance, or a hesitation in applause, the consequences could be deadly. Trials were quick, evidence meaningless, verdicts predetermined. A man could be accused of treason in the morning and executed by evening, his family left to scatter, his wealth seized to feed the emperor's endless hunger for spectacle. There were times when executions became part of the theater itself. Prisoners were dragged into the arena not merely for justice, but for amusement. Stories tell of Caligula ordering entire rows of spectators to be seized at random and thrown to wild beasts, simply because he was bored with the performance and wanted something more shocking. Imagine the terror of sitting in a crowd, watching the games when suddenly soldiers march towards your section, pulling men, women, even children from their seats to meet a gruesome fate, all because the emperor's mood demanded it. And it was not only enemies who suffered. Caligula's cruelty reached even those closest to him. Friends, advisors, even family members found themselves victims of his paranoia and rage. To love the emperor was dangerous, for affection could sour into suspicion overnight. A trusted ally could become an accused traitor in the blink of an eye. The palace, for all its marble splendor and golden halls, was not a place of comfort, but a cage of fear, where each servant, each noble, each guard wondered if today would be their last. His cruelty was not always grand or public. At times, it was disturbingly personal. He seemed to enjoy watching others squirm under the weight of impossible choices. A senator might be ordered to laugh at a tragedy, or to weep at a comedy, his emotions bent to the emperor's will. Failure meant humiliation, or worse. It was as though Caligula sought to prove that he could command not only actions but thoughts and feelings themselves, reaching into the private hearts of those around him and reshaping them for his own amusement. The unpredictability of it all was perhaps the most terrifying. A cruel emperor can be endured if his cruelty follows rules, if his wrath is predictable. But Caligula offered no such certainty. One day he might shower a man with honors, gifts of gold and land, praising him before the people. The next day that same man might be dragged through the streets, stripped, beaten, executed, his memory erased, his family destroyed. There was no safety, no pattern, no protection. Loyalty was meaningless, service no guarantee. To live under Caligula was to live at the mercy of chance, of a coin flipped in the emperor's mind. It is said that he even turned his cruelty into a kind of philosophy. He He once remarked that there was nothing in the world more delightful than the sight of another man's suffering. Whether or not he truly believed this, his actions seemed to embody it. He sought not only to control, but to savor the act of control, to find pleasure in the breaking of others, as though each humiliation, each execution, was proof of his godlike power. Rome itself reflected his cruelty. The streets, once filled with proud citizens, grew quieter, the air heavier. Whispers replaced open conversation. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, fearing that a careless word might be repeated and twisted into treason. Fear seeped into the markets, into the temples, into the very stones of the city. Rome, the empire of law and order, had become the empire of one man's madness. And yet, the strange paradox of Caligula's cruelty was that it coexisted with moments of lavish generosity. He would fund games for the people, distribute coins, or open granaries, only to seize it all back in some sudden fit of rage. It was as though he dangled kindness before Rome, only to snatch it away again, a cruel trick to remind them that even their joy was his to control. The people cheered, but their cheers were hollow, built on fear, not love. The Senate, too, continued to bow, continued to praise, but their voices trembled, their smiles strained. They had no choice. Each word of flattery was a shield, each gesture of reverence a desperate attempt to survive another day. Yet survival under Caligula was always uncertain. His cruelty was not something that could be bargained with. It was the very air of his reign, the pulse of his rule, unpredictable and unrelenting. And as the years passed, as more and more lives were broken beneath his power, Rome began to wonder how long such a reign could last. Could one man's madness consume an empire? Could cruelty be sustained indefinitely, without tearing apart the very fabric of society? The answers were unclear, but one truth was certain. Caligula's Rome was no longer ruled by law or tradition, but by fear, and that fear was bound only to grow darker with time. As Caligula's cruelty deepened, so too did his hunger for wealth. To him, money was never simply a tool of governance. It was fuel for his extravagance, a resource to transform into theaters of wonder and horror, and another chain with which to bind the empire under his control. The vast treasury he had inherited from the frugality of Tiberius began to shrink at a terrifying pace, drained by spectacles, games, and indulgences no empire could hope to sustain. He spent lavishly on banquets that seemed less like meals and more like demonstrations of power. Guests would recline on couches gilded with gold, sipping wines brought from distant provinces, each sip worth more than a soldier's annual wage. Dishes were served that bordered on the absurd, pearls dissolved into vinegar to create a drink, bread sprinkled with gold dust, entire animals roasted whole for display rather than nourishment. What might feed 100 men was instead consumed by a few, and often only partly, with much of it thrown away. For Caligula, the waste itself was part of the point. It was proof that his wealth was so vast, it could be squandered without consequence. But the consequence soon became clear. Rome's coffers, once overflowing, now echoed with emptiness. The public works that had once strengthened the empire fell into neglect as resources were diverted to the emperor's endless demands. Soldiers grumbled as their pay grew uncertain. Provinces groaned beneath the weight of new taxes, imposed to fill the gaps left by his excess. Merchants, once thriving, watched their fortunes wither under levies that seemed as arbitrary as the emperor's mood. To replenish the treasury, Caligula turned to schemes that revealed both his ingenuity and his madness. He instituted taxes on the most ordinary aspects of daily life, reaching deep into the routines of citizens. Fees were demanded for marriages, for lawsuits, for goods sold in markets, even for the wages of soldiers. Prostitutes were ordered to pay a portion of their earnings directly to the imperial coffers, and shockingly, it is said that Caligula himself opened a palace brothel staffed by the wives of senators and nobles. Their degradation turned into another source of profit. For Rome, this was not only humiliating but obscene.
a spectacle of corruption where money and morality collapsed together. Yet it was not enough. Stories tell of Caligula ordering Roman citizens to write wills, leaving their estates to him, the emperor. Those who resisted were accused of treason or taxed until they broke. Wealthy men were targeted, their fortunes seized under flimsy accusations, their families left ruined. To live with wealth in Caligula's Rome was not a blessing but a curse, for prosperity marked you as prey for the emperor's greed. Even the sacred was not spared. Temples were stripped of their treasures, their gold melted down to fund his whim. Statues, once offered to gods, were torn apart for their jewels. For Caligula, the gods themselves seemed no more deserving of wealth than the people, for was he not in his own eyes above them all? The desperation of his finances gave birth to strange performance. He staged auctions of palace furnishings and state property, sitting as auctioneer himself, mocking bidders, forcing nobles to spend sums they could not afford. At these events, laughter mixed with fear, for bidding was not a choice but a command. To hesitate was to risk insult, or worse, senators, their fortunes dwindling, bought tables, couches, trinkets, anything the emperor placed before them, all under the watchful gaze of a man who delighted in their ruin. Perhaps most infamous of all was his floating palace, a fleet of ships transformed into extravagant pleasure barges, complete with marble floors, gardens, and even temples. These vessels, floating across the Bay of Baia, consumed unimaginable sums. On them Caligula feasted, entertained, and indulged in pleasures that blurred the line between celebration and debauchery. Each barge was a symbol of his detachment from reality, drifting like an island of decadence while the empire strained beneath the weight of his demand. For ordinary Romans, the strain was felt in every corner of life. Grain became more expensive, wages less secure, families tightened their belts, while the emperor seemed to grow more distant from their struggle. The sense of Rome as a shared community, of citizens bound together by duty and tradition, withered under the pressure of one man's endless appetite. The empire, once proud of its wealth and stability, now felt fragile, drained, its veins emptied into the hands of a ruler who treated fortune as theater. And yet, despite the ruin he brought, Caligula seemed to thrive on the tension. Each tax, each confiscation, each humiliating auction was not only about money, but about domination. He wanted Rome to know that everything, their property, their livelihoods, even their futures, belonged to him. His greed was inseparable from his cruelty, for in every coin he seized, in every fortune he destroyed, there was a reminder. Rome existed only to serve his will. For those who lived through it, the cruelty of poverty was as sharp as the cruelty of the sword. A family stripped of wealth might find itself destitute overnight, their estates confiscated, their name shamed. Farmers and laborers, already stretched thin, bore heavier burdens, their toil feeding not their own children but the emperor's endless banquet. And while the people suffered, the emperor drifted across the bay on ships of marble, feasting under the stars, convinced of his divine right to consume all that Rome had to offer. Rome had endured tyrants before, men who sought wealth and power, but Caligula's hunger felt different. It was not the hunger of a man seeking to secure an empire, but of one seeking to devour it. And as the coffers emptied, as the empire strained, a question lingered in the shadows. How long could such ruin last? How long could one man's extravagance be carried by the shoulders of millions? The people whispered, the Senate grumbled, the soldiers grew restless, and yet Caligula continued, his reign a feast upon the body of Rome itself, each coin taken, each treasure seized, another reminder that nothing, not wealth, not dignity, not even survival, lay beyond his reach.
If Caligula's extravagance drained Rome's treasury, it was his private life that drained the last remnants of the empire's moral patience. The stories whispered about his personal behavior, the rumors that drifted through the marble halls of the Palatine, painted a picture not only of indulgence but of deep disturbance. In Rome, an emperor was meant to embody the dignity of the state, a living reflection of its strength and virtue. But Caligula seemed determined to mock that image, to twist it until it became grotesque. A spectacle of scandal played out in bedrooms and banquet halls. The most persistent of these rumors surrounded his relationships with his sisters. Rome, though tolerant of many indulgences, recoiled at whispers of incest. Yet stories circulated that Caligula kept his sisters not only as family, but as lovers, flaunting them at feasts, treating them as empresses, and elevating them above all other women of the empire. His sister Drusilla, in particular, was said to be the object of his greatest affection. He reportedly treated her with the reverence of a wife, dining with her in public, appearing with her in ceremonies, and openly defying the boundaries of tradition and morality. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 CE, Caligula's grief was profound, but it was also unnerving. He declared a period of mourning across the empire, elevating her to divine status, and ordering the people to worship her as a goddess. For many Romans, this was a step too far. Grief for a sister was natural, but sanctifying her in temples, demanding public reverence for her memory, only fueled the belief that something unnatural had always lingered between them. The line between family affection and something darker seemed blurred beyond recognition, and Rome watched uneasily as their emperor wept and raged in ways that unsettled even his closest allies. But Drusilla was not the only sister rumored to have been entangled in his life. Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla were both accused of having shared his bed, though some historians argue these accusations may have been exaggerated by political enemies after his death. Still, the persistence of the rumors suggests that his conduct gave them fertile ground. The idea that Rome's emperor, the supposed guardian of its traditions, might turn the most sacred of bonds into scandal was enough to unsettle the very core of Roman society. Caligula's private life extended beyond his family. He seemed obsessed with the act of possession itself, collecting women as one might collect treasure. It is said that during feasts, he would casually summon the wives of senators, disappearing with them into side chambers, returning with mocking comments about their performance, while their husbands sat humiliated in silence. To resist was impossible. To object was treason. Men who had once walked the Senate's halls with pride now found themselves reduced to pawns in the emperor's games, their wives taken, their dignity stripped away in front of their peers. For Caligula, these acts were not only about desire but about power. To humiliate a senator by seizing his wife was to strip him of authority in the most personal way imaginable. Every stolen glance, every whispered rumor, every public taunt was another reminder that even the most intimate aspects of a Roman's life were not his own. They belonged to the emperor, and his pursuits did not stop at the palace. Across Rome, whispers told of his nights spent wandering in disguise, seeking pleasures in the taverns, the brothels, the hidden corners of the city. To some, these stories painted him as a man desperate to taste the life of ordinary citizens. To others, they revealed a ruler incapable of respecting boundaries, a man whose power emboldened him to cross every line, no matter how sacred. The paradox of Caligula's private life was that it was at once hidden and public. The details were whispered in fear, but the displays were often made openly, almost proudly, as if the emperor wanted to shock, to unsettle, to flaunt his disregard for the rules that bound everyone else. Rome could not look away even as it recoiled. The more Rome whispered, the more Caligula seemed to feed on it. Scandal became another form of theatre, another weapon in his arsenal. If wealth could be wasted to show his power, if senators could be humiliated to display his dominance, then morals could be shattered to prove that even Rome's deepest taboos meant nothing in his hand. To be emperor in Caligula's mind was not to uphold tradition, but to demonstrate that he alone was above it. The palace, once the heart of the empire, had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Courtiers learned to avert their eyes,
to feign ignorance of what they saw and heard. Servants carried secrets like fragile burdens, knowing that a careless word might lead to their death. Even family members lived in fear, for in Caligula's Rome, kinship was no protection. Indeed, it could be a curse, drawing one closer to his obsessions, his moods, his unpredictable run. Yet even in these dark tales there remains an uncertainty. Ancient historians often wrote with the biases of their time, eager to vilify a man they despised, quick to turn rumor into fact. It is possible that some stories were exaggerated, others invented, the truth buried beneath layers of gossip and hatred. But the consistency of the accounts, the sheer number of whispers that align, suggest that at the very least, Caligula's conduct gave his enemies more than enough reason to believe the worst. For the people of Rome, truth mattered less than perception, and the perception was clear. Their emperor lived a life that mocked morality, defied tradition, and blurred the lines between family, power, and desire. Whether every detail was true or not, the image of Caligula's reign became inseparable from scandal. A portrait of an emperor who believed that nothing, not wealth, not law, not love, was beyond his grasp. And as the scandals multiplied, as the whispers grew louder, Rome itself seemed to sink deeper into unease. For if the emperor could so openly defy the most sacred boundaries, what else might he defy? If nothing was forbidden to him, then nothing in Rome was truly safe. By the time Caligula's scandals had saturated Rome with unease, his reign began to take on the quality of theatre. Power for him was no longer merely about ruling, it was about spectacle, performance, and the crafting of scenes so audacious that they blurred the line between history and madness. Rome itself became his stage, and its people, whether they wished it or not, his unwilling audience. One of the most infamous tales is that of his so-called campaign against the sea. In 39 CE, Caligula led his legions northward to the coast of Gaul, supposedly preparing to invade Britain. The soldiers, hardened men who had marched across continents, who had faced Germanic tribes and Parthian archers, followed him with the expectation of war. Yet what awaited them was not the clash of arms, but a command so bizarre it would echo through history. According to the accounts, Caligula ordered his men to line up along the shoreline and charge into the waves as though fighting an invisible foe. Instead of enemy warriors, they struck the surf. Instead of plunder, they gathered seashells, which he declared spoils of the ocean, trophies of victory over Neptune, the god of the sea. Chests of shells were carried back to Rome as if they were the riches of conquest. For soldiers who had expected glory, the act was humiliating. For senators who heard the tale, it was another sign that their emperor's mind was unmoored. But for Caligula it was theatre, an announcement to gods and men alike that even the sea itself could be made to bow before him. This blending of spectacle and madness defined his later years. He built temporary bridges of boats across stretches of water, creating floating roads so he might ride his chariot back and forth in a display of impossible ambition. He staged processions in which he dressed as gods, Jupiter with his thunderbolt, Apollo with his lyre, Venus adorned in jewels, demanding the people not only accept these roles but worship him in them. To Caligula, there was no distinction between man and divinity, no boundary between ruler and deity. The emperor was Rome, Rome was divine, and therefore he himself was God. But while his grandiose visions captivated, they also terrified. For the Senate the message was clear: the emperor's will was absolute, and to question it was to question the divine itself. For the people, each spectacle became a reminder that they were living within a drama, one whose script was written by a man who cared more for applause than stability. His obsession with performance seeped into every corner of Roman life. Gladiatorial games, once fierce contests of skill and survival, became stages for his cruelty. He would appear at the arena not as a mere spectator, but as a director, altering matches on a whim. Sometimes he ordered fights to end abruptly, other times he demanded they continue until no one was left standing. On occasion he commanded ordinary citizens to be thrown into the arena, condemning them to sudden and senseless deaths for no greater reason than his own amusement. To attend his games was to risk being swept into them, an audience always one step away from becoming actors in his macabre play. Even justice became theatre. Trials were held not in the quiet dignity of courts, but in the noisy halls of his presence, where verdicts were determined less by law than by the emperor's mood. Senators, nobles, and even commoners found themselves performing their innocence or their guilt before him, knowing that the outcome was not truth but entertainment. He laughed at their pleas, mocked their tears, and turned their suffering into another act in his endless show. And yet, despite the absurdity, there was something deeply calculated beneath the chaos. Caligula understood the power of fear, the way spectacle could break the spirit as surely as chain. Each bizarre act was not only a performance but a demonstration that Rome's traditions, its gods, its armies, even its laws were his to command, his to twist, his to mock. If he could send soldiers to gather seashells as trophies, what could he not make Rome itself do? For the people, daily life under such a ruler was disorienting. They woke never knowing what decree might emerge, what spectacle might be demanded. Today a feast with overflowing abundance, tomorrow a tax on marriage, today a procession of gods in golden robes, tomorrow executions for imagined conspiracies. Rome was no longer governed by order, but by whim, its destiny dictated by the shifting moods of one man's mind. The whispers grew louder. Soldiers mocked in private the campaign against the sea. Senators gritted their teeth as they bowed before a man who demanded worship as Jupiter one day and Venus the next. Merchants cursed the emptiness of their purses as new levies drained their profit. And through it all the people wondered, how long could this theatre continue before the curtain fell? But for Caligula there was no end to the performance. Each act needed to be bigger, stranger, more shocking than the last. Power was not enough. It had to be displayed, dramatized, exaggerated, until it consumed the world around him. The emperor's reign was no longer about Rome. It was about Caligula's drama, Caligula's myth, and all who lived beneath him, from senator to soldier to slave, were merely players in a story they could neither script nor escape. As the empire strained under the weight of his demands, one truth became clear. Rome was not ruled, it was performed, and the man on its throne was no longer merely an emperor, but an actor lost in his own role, a figure who believed himself immortal, because no one dared break the illusion.
As Caligula's reign spiraled further into chaos and spectacle, another shadow began to stretch over the empire, the shadow of paranoia. In Rome, power was never secure, no matter how divine a ruler claimed to be. Senators schemed in quiet corners, generals whispered with soldiers, and even within the emperor's household, loyalty was fragile. Caligula, for all his bravado and theatrical displays, seemed to sense it. He lived with the growing certainty that daggers were hidden in every smile, that betrayal lingered behind every bowed head, and so his reign, already strange and cruel, began to take on a darker edge, one defined not by spectacle alone but by fear. The Senate had long grown weary of his humiliations. These were men who once debated policy, who once carried the pride of Rome on their shoulders. Now they were little more than props in his theatre. Some had seen their wives mocked, others their fortunes drained, still others forced into humiliating performances to amuse their emperor. Their patience thinned, but their fear kept them silent. Caligula, sensing their discontent, only tightened the noose, reminding them constantly that their power was nothing without him. He spoke of them as slaves, ridiculed their traditions, and sometimes executed senators on flimsy accusations of conspiracy. The message was clear. Loyalty was irrelevant. Submission was the only shield. But paranoia is a fire that, once lit, consumes everything. Soon even allies were not safe. His own guards, the Praetorians, whose loyalty was supposed to be absolute, became objects of suspicion. To maintain their favor, he showered them with gifts, bribes, and privileges, draining the treasury further just to secure the fragile illusion of safety. But trust is not bought so easily, and in the quiet of their barracks, soldiers whispered the same fears and doubts that spread through Rome. Family, too, was no refuge. His surviving sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, once elevated, now fell into his suspicion. Both were accused of plotting against him, whether through truth or through rumor, and both were exiled, cast away like pawns no longer useful in his game. Even blood could not protect one from the emperor's paranoia. The palace that once overflowed with laughter and feasts became a cold prison, its halls echoing not with joy but with fear of his sudden rages, his unpredictable commands. Perhaps the most striking sign of his paranoia was his obsession with assassination plots. He surrounded himself with guards, demanded constant surveillance, and devised tests of loyalty so cruel and senseless that they left even his supporters trembling. At feasts, he was known to laugh suddenly, claiming he could have every man at the table killed with a single word. Sometimes he turned the jest into reality, ordering executions mid-banquet, transforming celebrations into scenes of horror. His paranoia was not only a shield but a weapon, one he used to remind Rome that he was untouchable, or at least that was what he wanted them to believe. And yet, beneath the cruelty, one can almost sense the fear gnawing at him. Caligula had grown up in a world where betrayal was common, where exile and execution claimed his family one by one. Perhaps deep within he knew his own fate would be no different. He clung to the illusions of divinity, declaring himself a living god, demanding temples and worship, as if holiness itself might ward off the assassins he so often imagined. But gods do not bleed, and Caligula's enemies knew he was only a man. Rome itself began to strain under his paranoia. New taxes were levied, not only to fund his spectacles, but to bribe loyalty, to pay for the ever-growing web of guards and spies. Merchants, artisans, and farmers all felt the weight of his demands. The people, once joyous at his ascension, now muttered in resentment, their cheers replaced by silent curses. Even the soldiers who once adored the little boots of their childhood now questioned whether the man they followed was leading them to glory, or simply dragging them into madness. The tension grew with each passing month. Senators avoided one another's eyes, fearing association with a supposed plot. Guards clutched their weapons tighter, wondering whether they were protecting the emperor or themselves from him. Families spoke in hushed tones, their loyalty eroded by fear, their faith in Rome's future shaken. The empire had weathered cruel rulers before, but there was something uniquely destabilizing about Caligula's reign. It was not merely cruelty, it was unpredictability. No one could anticipate his next command, his next performance, his next execution, and so everyone lived in a state of waiting, waiting for the next shock, waiting for the next spectacle, waiting perhaps for the inevitable end. The whispers of conspiracy began to take form. In the shadows of Rome, senators quietly discussed possibilities. Praetorians weighed their loyalty against survival, and even ordinary citizens began to dream of a world without him. It was dangerous to think such thoughts, but in a city where one man's paranoia poisoned every breath, they became almost impossible to avoid. Caligula, in his own twisted way, seemed to court this fate. The more fearful he became, the more provocative his actions grew, as if daring his enemies to act, as if testing whether anyone in Rome still possessed the courage to strike. He was an emperor who demanded worship, but who also seemed to invite hatred. And in this paradox, the stage was set for the climax of his story. Rome had watched him rise with joy, endure with confusion, and rule with terror. Now, as his paranoia deepened, as the city itself strained beneath the weight of his madness, one question lingered in the air. How long could he survive in a world he had turned entirely against him? By the final years of Caligula's rule, the paranoia that had settled like a fog over Rome grew thicker, suffocating the empire in fear and uncertainty. His earlier spectacles, the seashell campaigns, the mock triumphs, the divine impersonations, had once seemed merely bizarre, almost absurd. But now,
Woven through with suspicion and cruelty, they became something darker, something far more dangerous. Rome was no longer simply entertained or bewildered, it was terrified. Caligula's cruelty became sharper, more personal. It was not enough for him to be obeyed. He needed submission, humiliation, and proof that every soul in Rome existed at his whim. Senators who had once bowed were now forced to grovel. Men of noble birth, heirs to centuries of tradition, were made to run beside his chariot like slaves, panting and stumbling as the emperor whipped the horses faster. Others were commanded to kiss his feet in public, their dignity stripped away before the crowd. Each insult was carefully chosen, not simply to wound, but to remind Rome that no rank, no heritage, no reputation could shield one from his will. Executions became more frequent, often carried out for trivial slights or imagined betrayal. Sometimes the condemned were men of influence, their removal serving as both punishment and warning. Other times they were ordinary citizens who happened to fall into his gaze at the wrong moment. Their deaths meant nothing to the empire but everything to the emperor, who seemed to take pleasure in proving that life itself was his to grant or destroy. At his feasts, he amused himself by inviting nobles and wealthy citizens, only to suddenly strip them of their possessions during the meal. One guest might find his lands seized, another might be ordered to hand over his wife or daughter. Guests who laughed too loudly or too little risked insult, exile, or worse. The banquets, once celebrations of abundance, became tests of survival. To be invited to dine with Caligula was no longer an honor, but a danger, a night of forced smiles and trembling hearts, where any misstep might lead to ruin. The emperor's paranoia warped even his relationships with the gods. Once content to dress as Jupiter or Apollo, he now demanded living proof of their obedience. He ordered statues of gods across Rome to be dismantled and their heads replaced with his own likeness. Shrines once sacred to the divine became monuments to himself, marble faces of deities stripped away, replaced by the sharp features of Caligula. The people, already weary of his blasphemies, felt a deeper unease. It was not only Rome's laws he mocked now, but the gods themselves. The treasury, long drained by his spectacles and gifts to soldiers, suffered further under the weight of his whims. New taxes fell heavily on the people, not just on wealth but on everyday acts of life. Marriages, lawsuits, and even the wages of common laborers were burdened with levies, their earnings funneled into the emperor's endless games and bribes. The empire groaned beneath the strain, yet few dared to speak, for to protest was to risk being labeled a traitor. Even the soldiers, once the foundation of his power, felt the sting of his cruelty. Caligula delighted in reminding them that their loyalty was not their choice but his to command. During inspections he mocked their discipline, berated their officers, and sometimes ordered punishments without cause. Stories spread of soldiers forced to carry out absurd commands, their honor chipped away for no reason other than to amuse him. Loyalty bought with gifts was fragile, and the Praetorian Guard, who once swore to protect him, now felt the slow corrosion of resentment. All the while whispers of conspiracy spread through the city. Senators met in hushed gatherings, sharing stories of insults and loss. Merchants, drained by taxes, spoke in mutters of their despair. Even the common people, their patience worn thin, looked upon their emperor with more fear than reverence. Rome, once united in its adoration of little boots, was now bound together by the quiet hope that his reign might end. And Caligula seemed almost to sense it. His speeches grew more venomous, his punishments more arbitrary. He accused senators of treason for failing to worship him as a god, accused generals of cowardice for victories not won in his name, accused citizens of blasphemy for failing to cheer loudly enough in the street. His paranoia had become prophecy. In treating every man as a potential conspirator, he ensured that one day they would indeed conspire. The palace itself became a cage of suspicion. Servants trembled in the corridors, guards shifted nervously in their posts, and family members lived as exiles within their own home, afraid to draw too much attention. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every whisper a plot. Caligula, surrounded by marble and gold, lived in isolation, adored by no one, feared by all. Rome had endured emperors who were cruel, emperors who were eccentric, emperors who demanded obedience, but never had it endured one who combined all three with such reckless abandon. The city was not merely ruled, it was tormented. Each day brought new decrees, each night new executions, and always the sense that this could not last, that something must break. And so, as Caligula pushed further into his madness, as he lashed out at senators, drained the treasury, mocked the gods, and insulted his guards, the stage began to shift. The people who once trembled at his power began instead to dream of his downfall. The soldiers who once defended him began to question their loyalty. The senators who once bowed their heads began to lift them in silent defiance. The emperor himself, blind in his arrogance, could not see the storm gathering, or perhaps he did see it, and in his madness, welcomed it. For Caligula lived not for peace or stability, but for the spectacle, and what greater spectacle could there be than the fall of a god?
By the time Caligula entered the 4th year of his reign, Rome was exhausted. The empire had grown used to cruelty, but never before had cruelty been paired with such theatrical madness. Never before had it been so unpredictable. Senators avoided one another's gaze. Soldiers muttered in their camps. Citizens whispered in markets. Yet across all classes one thought began to echo more clearly than ever before. This could not continue, and so, in the very heart of Rome, in the corridors of power where whispers turned to plans, the seeds of conspiracy began to take root. It is often said that Caligula's downfall was sealed not by senators or commoners, but by the very men sworn to protect him, the Praetorian Guard. These were elite soldiers, chosen to guard the emperor, paid richly for their loyalty, but loyalty is a fragile thing, and Caligula's reign had tested theirs to the breaking point. He mocked their discipline, demanded absurd displays of devotion, and at times even struck them in public, laughing as though it were all a jest. Some he forced into humiliating roles at his spectacles, parading them before crowds as though their honor were nothing. And while he bribed them with gifts, the gold was never enough to cover the sting of insult. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a commander of the guard. History tells us Caligula taunted him mercilessly, mocking his voice, his manner, and his masculinity. To the emperor, it was another cruel joke. To Chaerea, it was humiliation that cut deeper with every word. Over time, insult hardened into hatred, and hatred became resolve. If Caligula thought himself untouchable, Chaerea would prove otherwise. The senators too saw opportunity in the discontent of the guard. They had long suffered Caligula's humiliations, being forced to run beside his chariot, to worship him as a god, to lose fortunes and family on his whim. Many had watched friends executed, others exiled, their dignity stripped away one command at a time. For them, survival meant silence, but now, with whispers of betrayal stirring among the Praetorians, they sensed a chance to end their suffering, and so, senators and soldiers, once divided by tradition, found themselves bound together by a shared desire. Caligula had to die. Still, the plan was not simple. The emperor was unpredictable, his guards many, his suspicions constant. Yet paradoxically, it was his own arrogance that gave his enemies an opening. For despite his paranoia, despite his fear of plots and shadows, Caligula could never resist a performance, and performances meant vulnerability. The plan, then, was to strike not in darkness or secrecy, but in the light of one of his own spectacles, a festival, a celebration, a moment when the emperor would be surrounded not by walls of guards, but by the very men planning his end. The conspirators bided their time, each insult feeding their resolve, each humiliation pushing them closer to action. Meanwhile, Caligula remained blind to the danger. He laughed at the senators he degraded, dismissed the soldiers he mocked,
and reveled in the illusion of immortality. He believed himself divine, untouchable, beyond the reach of mortal hands. The gods themselves, he claimed, had no power over him, and yet in the quiet chambers of Rome, mortal hands were sharpening daggers. The city itself seemed to sense the tension. Markets bustled, feasts were held, sacrifices offered. Yet beneath the noise was unease, a quiet knowledge that something was nearing its end. Perhaps it was no more than the collective exhaustion of a people living under constant fear. Or perhaps, as some ancient writers suggested, even the gods had grown tired of Caligula's mockery and looked upon Rome with pity, ready to see justice done. On the surface, all remained as it had been. Caligula staged his grand spectacles, dressed as gods and heroes, basked in the forced cheers of the crowds, and reminded his subjects again and again of his power. Yet behind the cheers, eyes met in silence, promises were exchanged in whispers, and steps were taken in secret corridors. The plot was alive, and its heartbeat grew stronger each day. For Cassius Chaerea, the matter was personal, but it was also practical. Caligula's rule had become a danger not only to Rome's dignity, but to its stability. His cruelty drained the Senate, his taxes drained the people, his recklessness drained the treasury, and his mockery drained the loyalty of the guard. If nothing was done, Rome itself might collapse under the weight of his madness. And so, in Chaerea's mind, the dagger was not only an act of revenge, but of duty. Still, danger clung to the plan. If the attempt failed, the conspirators would be destroyed, their families ruined, their names erased from memory. Caligula's wrath, if he survived, would burn hotter than ever, and no corner of the empire would be safe for those who dared defy him. Yet the conspirators pressed on, their hatred outweighing their fear, and so the stage was set. Rome's god-emperor, convinced of his own immortality, strutted through marble halls, unaware that every step brought him closer to the end. Senators rehearsed their roles, praetorians steeled their nerves, and Chaerea sharpened his resolve. It is one of history's great ironies that the man who believed himself a living god would soon discover just how mortal he truly was. The day dawned like any other in Caligula's reign, with the emperor preparing not for duty, not for governance, but for spectacle. A festival was planned, one of his endless performances designed to dazzle the people and remind them of his divinity. He strode through the palace halls with confidence, draped in silks and jewels, his laughter echoing off marble columns. To him, it was another day of glory. To those waiting in shadow, it was the day of reckoning. The conspirators had chosen carefully, public enough to guarantee Caligula's presence, but private enough to control the setting. The festival drew nobles, soldiers, and performers into the theatre-like spaces of the imperial palace. Music played, incense burned, and the emperor, intoxicated with his own image, moved among the crowd with the air of a man who believed himself untouchable. Cassius Chaerea was there, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, standing at his post as though nothing were amiss. To all eyes he appeared loyal, calm, dutiful, yet beneath his armor, his heart raced with the weight of what was to come. Months of humiliation pressed down on him, each insult Caligula had hurled, twisting into steel. This was not only vengeance, it was deliverance. The emperor, oblivious, performed for his guests, mocking senators, joking crudely, and reminding everyone of his supposed divinity. At one point he paused to watch dancers, his face alight with amusement, his voice carrying across the chamber in boasts that he was greater than Jupiter himself. Those around him forced laughter, their eyes carefully avoiding one another, their thoughts focused only on survival until the moment arrived. And then, like a shift in the wind, it came. Caligula left the performance, moving down a passageway that connected the theatre to his private chamber. He was accompanied by a small group, fewer guards than usual. For here, inside the palace, he felt secure. The corridor was dim, torchlight flickering on stone walls, shadows dancing with each step. It was in that shadowed place that Cheria and the others struck. The first blow was swift and brutal. Cheria himself is said to have delivered it, driving his blade into the emperor's neck with the force of years of humiliation behind it. Caligula staggered, shocked, his voice caught in disbelief. He cried out not as a god, but as a man, startled by the sudden reminder of his own mortality. The others followed, their daggers flashing in the gloom. Senators, guards, men who had once bowed in fear, now struck with fury. The emperor tried to fight, tried to flee, but the corridor was too narrow, the blades too many. Each strike tore away another layer of his arrogance. Each wound another reminder that divinity was an illusion. Blood spilled across marble, dripping down the walls, soaking the floor where his jeweled slippers slipped and faltered. It was not a quick death. The conspirators, driven by rage, stabbed again and again, as though one blow could never be enough to erase the years of cruelty, the endless humiliations, the weight of terror he had forced upon them. When at last he fell, his body lay broken, his silks torn, his jewels scattered. The god emperor lay silent, his divinity shattered, his reign ended in a dark corridor of his own palace. For a moment the conspirators stood in stunned silence, the reality of what they had done pressing down on them. Rome's emperor, the man who believed himself immortal, lay dead at their feet. The man who had mocked them, taxed them, tortured them and paraded himself as a god was gone. Yet even in victory there was fear. Outside those walls, the city did not yet know. Soldiers still loyal to Caligula might rise in fury. Crowds, accustomed to his rule, might riot. The empire stood on the edge of chaos. The body was hurriedly hidden, dragged away from the passage, so that panic would not immediately erupt. But word spreads quickly in Rome, faster than any conspirator could control. Whispers became shouts, shouts became cries. The emperor was dead. Caligula was no more. In the palace, chaos erupted. Some rejoiced openly, their chains lifted, their fear dissolved in sudden freedom. Others trembled, uncertain what vengeance might come, uncertain whether the gods themselves would strike Rome down for the murder of a man who had claimed divinity. Among the Praetorian Guard, loyalty fractured, some furious at the betrayal, others relieved to be rid of him, all uncertain of what came next. And what of Caligula himself, the man who had believed he could not die? In that final moment, he was nothing more than mortal. His reign had lasted barely 4 years, yet it had scarred Rome deeply, leaving behind memories of cruelty, humiliation, extravagance, and madness. His dream of divinity ended not with worship, but with daggers in the dark. The city stood on the edge of something new. The emperor was gone, but the question lingered. What would come after? Rome was too vast, too powerful, to remain leaderless, and yet the throne was stained with blood, its authority fractured by betrayal. For those who lived through that day, one memory must have lingered strongest of all: the sight of Caligula, once adored, once worshipped, once feared as a god, lying lifeless in his palace, a man undone by the very people who had bowed to him. The reign of madness had ended, but the echoes of it would haunt Rome for generations to come.
When Caligula fell beneath the blades of his own guards, Rome did not erupt in triumph, but in confusion. The emperor who had declared himself a god now lay silent, his body hidden hurriedly away, but the vacuum he left was vast and dangerous. For a moment the empire seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, balanced between relief and terror. The conspirators had acted boldly, yet even as they wiped the blood from their daggers, they realized their plan was not complete. To kill an emperor was one thing, to secure Rome afterward was another. Without a clear successor, the empire was vulnerable to chaos. Loyalists might rally, soldiers might mutiny, and the people uncertain whom to follow could tear the city apart. The Senate, long humiliated by Caligula, seized the moment. Some senators dreamed of restoring the old republic, of a Rome once again ruled not by emperors but by them. They gathered in haste, speaking of liberty, of throwing off the chains of tyranny, of erasing the memory of Caligula with a return to the ancient ways. Yet their voices, though bold, were uncertain. Too many remembered what had happened before, when the Republic had collapsed into civil wars, when Julius Caesar had been cut down only for another emperor to rise in his place. Meanwhile, the Praetorian Guard stood divided. They had struck the fatal blows, yet not all had been part of the plot. Some were loyal still to the idea of empire, if not to Caligula himself. Others, their hands stained with the emperor's blood, now feared retribution if order was not restored swiftly. In their barracks, whispers spread. Who would lead them now? Who would pay their wages? Who would command their loyalty? The death of one emperor was not the end of empire, and they knew Rome could not live long without a master. Among the people, the reaction was mixed. For some there was joy. A cruel tyrant was gone, and with him perhaps the crushing taxes and the endless humiliations. For others, there was fear. Caligula had ruled as a god, and gods were not meant to die. His assassination felt like blasphemy, and in the superstitious hearts of many Romans, there lingered a dread that divine punishment would follow. Markets closed, temples filled with anxious prayers, and in the streets, crowds gathered not in celebration but in nervous anticipation. The conspirators, in their moment of triumph, discovered that their task was far from finished. They had removed Caligula, but who would rise in his place? Rome had seen emperors fall before, and always another figure had stepped from the shadows to claim the throne. Without such a figure, power itself would shatter, and the empire with it. And then, almost by accident, history found its answer. Hiding in the palace during the chaos was Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man long dismissed as weak, awkward and unfit for power. He had survived by being overlooked, his stammer and limp making him an object of mockery rather than threat. But on that day, as soldiers searched the palace for direction, they found him trembling behind a curtain. Instead of killing him, they raised him up. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was pragmatism, but in Claudius the guard saw not just a man but an opportunity. For while the Senate debated ideals and the people prayed for stability, the guard wanted something simpler, an emperor who would secure their pay, protect their honor, and restore order. Claudius, timid though he seemed, was a member of the imperial family, a link to Augustus, a figure they could present to Rome as legitimate. And so, lifted from hiding, Claudius was carried to the camp of the Praetorians, where the soldiers proclaimed him emperor. The Senate protested, their dream of a restored republic slipping through their fingers. They argued, they hesitated, they considered resistance, but the voice of the Senate was weak compared to the steel of the guard. Rome had learned long ago that power did not rest in speeches or ideals, but in swords, and so, reluctantly, the senators yielded. Claudius was confirmed, and the line of emperors continued. As for Caligula, his body was buried in haste, without the honors he had once demanded, his memory cursed by those who had feared him, yet not erased entirely. Rome, for all its hatred, remembered him still, remembered the cruelty, the arrogance, the madness, and the blood. His reign had lasted barely 4 years, yet it had burned itself deep into the history of the empire. In the quiet after his fall, Rome exhaled, though not in relief but in weary uncertainty. For though one tyrant was gone, the question remained, would the empire's future bring peace, or would it deliver another monster in his place? And in that uncertainty lies the truth of Rome's story, that power itself, unchecked and absolute, so often corrupted those who held it. Caligula was gone, but the system that had allowed him to rise remained, and so Rome waited, watching Claudius take the throne, wondering whether this new emperor would heal the wounds or tear them deeper. History is rarely gentle with its villains, and Caligula was no exception. In the days and months after his death, his image began to shift from feared ruler to cautionary tale. Those who had lived through his reign carried memories of cruelty, humiliation, and excess, but once he was gone,
memory hardened into legend. It is in that transformation that Caligula became not merely a man, but a symbol of everything Rome feared in an emperor. The Senate moved quickly to erase him. His decrees were overturned, his statues toppled, his name scratched from inscription. This was damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory, Rome's way of declaring that someone so shameful did not deserve to be remembered. Yet irony clung to the act, for in trying to erase him, they ensured he would be remembered all the more. The more they struck his name, the more his story clung to whispers and writings, growing darker with each retelling. Writers of the time, many of whom had suffered under his rule, painted him in colors of madness. They described him as a monster, a man without restraint, a tyrant who delighted in cruelty for its own sake. Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, the great chroniclers of Rome, passed down tales of his extravagance and depravity. Some of these accounts were surely true, others perhaps exaggerated, shaped by the hatred of those who had survived him, but truth mattered little once the image was formed. To Rome, Caligula had become the embodiment of insanity in power, and so, the stories grew. People whispered that he slept with his sisters, that he appointed his horse a senator, that he ordered bridges built across the sea simply to defy the gods. Each story, whether fact or rumor, deepened the legend of a man who had believed himself divine and had ruled with terrifying arrogance. In taverns, marketplaces and homes, his name became shorthand for the worst kind of emperor, not merely cruel, but unhinged. Yet even as his reputation blackened, there was a strange fascination, for beneath the horror lay a kind of morbid curiosity. How could one man rise so high and fall so far? How could Rome, with all its strength and tradition, be brought to its knees by the whims of a single ruler? Caligula's story was not only a warning, but a spectacle, retold again and again, because it was almost unbelievable. In the centuries that followed, Caligula became a figure larger than life, his excesses magnified with each generation. Medieval chroniclers described him as a devil in human form. Renaissance thinkers used him as an example of unchecked tyranny. Modern historians still debate how much of his reputation is fact and how much invention. Was he truly insane, or merely cruel? Were the most shocking stories true, or crafted by enemies to blacken his memory? The line between truth and legend blurred long ago, and in that blur lies his immortality. For the Roman people who lived after him, his reign left scars that outlived his death. His cruelty had drained the treasury, his mockery had broken the dignity of the Senate, and his extravagance had shown just how fragile the empire's stability could be. Even under Claudius, who followed him, Rome remained wary, haunted by the memory of how quickly a ruler could turn into a monster. And in this, perhaps, lies Caligula's truest legacy. He was remembered not for victories in battle, nor for building monuments, nor for expanding the empire. He was remembered for what he revealed, that the structures of Rome, mighty though they seemed, could be twisted by one man's will into instruments of terror. His reign became a mirror, reflecting the dangers of absolute power back at those who held it. Even now, nearly 2,000 years later, his name carries weight. Caligula is a symbol of madness in power, of decadence gone unchecked, of the human capacity for cruelty when cloaked in authority. The stories of his reign may have been dark, exaggerated, or even invented, but they endure because they speak to something timeless, the fear of what happens when power is given without restraint. And so Caligula lived on long after his death, not as a god, not even as a man, but as a warning whispered across centuries, that power without balance leads not to glory but to ruin. His statues crumbled, his decrees vanished, his body lay forgotten, but his story remained, carried forward not in marble but in memory, twisted, dark and enduring. And so, the curtain falls on Caligula's reign, a reign that burned brief but blinding, filled with excess, cruelty, and spectacle, unlike anything Rome had seen before. He began as a beloved figure, a child of the legions, a young emperor whose name stirred hope in a weary city. But in just a few short years, he descended into darkness, his rule transformed into a theater of fear. He mocked the Senate, drained the treasury, humiliated his people, and declared himself divine. And in the end, he fell as mortals do, not with the grandeur of a god, but with the blood of a man spilled in the shadows of his own palace. Yet his story did not end with his death. History carried him forward, reshaped him, and cast him as something larger than life. A warning, a legend, a figure whose name still stirs unease nearly 2,000 years later. Whether every tale told about him is true or not, the image remains. Caligula, the mad emperor, the tyrant whose excesses remind us of the fragility of power, the thin line between glory and ruin. For Rome, his fall was both a relief and a reckoning. The empire endured, as it always did, reshaping itself around new rulers, moving forward as though even the worst storms could not break it. But the scars of his reign remained, scars etched into the memory of senators who bowed in fear, soldiers who carried seashells as spoils of war, and citizens who whispered prayers in the dark against a man who claimed to be a god. And now, as we step back from his world, we can let those echoes fade. The marble halls grow quiet once more, the torches flicker out, and the laughter of Caligula drifts away into silence. His reign, for all its terror and spectacle, belongs to the past. What remains for us is reflection, a reminder of how absolute power can twist, how fear can silence, and how history remembers those who rule not with justice, but with madness. As you rest now, let the weight of Rome's shadows fall away. The daggers have been sheathed, the emperor is gone, and the city sleeps once again beneath the stars. In this quiet moment, there is no cruelty, no fear, no spectacle, only peace, only calm, only the soft rhythm of time carrying us ever forward. And so, as we close this journey through the past, may your mind find rest, and your body peace. Until next time, sleep well.